If you take a look at the southern part of Asia, you'll quickly identify some of the widely recognized countries of the region such as China, Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia. Right in between these countries is an irregularly round portion of land in the north that stretches out into a narrow region in the southeast. This chunk of land is a country known as Laos and is going to be our focus for this video. Nearly 3/4 of Laos is covered in mountains and forested hills that are too steep to live on. For this reason, most of the country's population resides along the most prominent Mekong River, which runs more than 2,600 miles from China up to the south of Vietnam. A French colony until 1953, Laos is the only landlocked country in southeastern Asia and is one of the very few remaining communist states. This isn't the only thing that makes this country unique though, because it also has the unfortunate title of being the most bombed country per capita in the world. In October 1887, following its victory over China in the Sino-French conflict, France obtained control over parts of southeastern Asia and formed the French Indochina colony, which was a territory made up of modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The Vietnamese, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, the founder of the Indochinese Communist Party, defeated the French in a very decisive battle which saw them give up their claims to the French Indochina colony at the Geneva Peace Conference in 1954. Subsequently, Laos and Cambodia achieved full independence while Vietnam was split into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, together with his Communist Party, seized North Vietnam and became its president, while the anti-communist Vietnamese, under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem, ruled the state of South Vietnam. Not long after the 1954 peace conference, Ho Chi Minh stated his intention to unify North Vietnam and South Vietnam into one communist nation. Although South Vietnam also wanted a unified nation, they were strongly against communism and wanted a Vietnam with close economic and cultural ties to the West. This difference eventually led to the Vietnam War, which began in 1955. As the war progressed, conflict spilled into neighboring countries such as Laos and Cambodia, and in 1959, the Communists began the construction of a special trail to support the war they were instigating in South Vietnam. This trail was named after Ho Chi Minh and was a secret military supply route running from North Vietnam to South Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail facilitated the movement of weapons, ammunition, manpower, and other supplies from North Vietnam to their supporters in South Vietnam. In an attempt to stop this traffic, the U.S. military began sending advisors to train the Laotian army to defend themselves and stop the advancement of the communists into South Vietnam. The U.S. troops were ordered not to engage in combat, but the communists did not operate under the same condition and soon began shooting down U.S. Army aircraft. The involvement of the United States in Laos started escalating in retaliation for the Vietnamese resistance, and by 1964, what started off as a small program to train the Laotian army turned into a full-scale secret bombing campaign. This campaign would become known as the Secret War, and the largest discreet operation ever conducted by the CIA. The goal of the operation was to destroy the North Vietnamese supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and repel the strong communist forces operating in Laos. The U.S. Air Force began bombing targets by flying planes like AC-130s and B-52s full of cluster bombs. When dropped from an aircraft, the cluster bomb opens mid-air and scatters a carpet of smaller bombs over a large area without any degree of accuracy. During the course of the operation, the CIA executed almost 600,000 bombing missions, resulting in more than 270 million cluster bomblets as well as 4 million bigger bombs being dropped on Laos. This is more than the total amount of bombs used by the US during the whole of World War II, and equivalent to one plane load of bombs being dropped every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 whole years on an area the size of Oregon in the United States. At the time of the bombings, this worked out to more than 1 bomb for every civilian in America and 10 bombs for every civilian in Laos, making it the most bombed country per capita in the world. As the war further progressed, more American troops were being sent to Laos and South Vietnam, and by the end of 1967, there were over 500,000 American soldiers in southeastern Asia, and the US government were spending nearly $20 billion per year on the wars. It wasn't until the publication of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971 that the public was made aware of the extent of the atrocities in southeastern Asia. Bombarded by horrific images of the war on their televisions, Americans at home turned against the war and began staging massive anti-Vietnam War protests. Following the election of President Richard Nixon in 1969, The National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger was ordered to begin secret talks with the North Vietnamese representatives in Paris. After more than 4 years of negotiations, the United States and North Vietnam finally concluded a peace agreement in 1973 that would end open hostilities in southeastern Asia. The settlement included a ceasefire throughout Vietnam and the release of all U.S. and other prisoners of war. Both sides also agreed to the withdrawal of all foreign troops from Laos and Cambodia in addition to the forbidding of bases and troop movements through these countries. North and South Vietnam would remain divided until the eventual reunification of the country through peaceful means. North Vietnam also pledged they wouldn't initiate any military movement across the DMZ, and that there would be no use of force to reunify the two countries. The then-President Richard Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accords, ending direct U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, and subsequently discontinuing the secret war in Laos. Once the last American military forces were out of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese leadership calculated that an American re-entry to help the South was highly unlikely, and in late 1974, they violated the peace agreement and launched a campaign to win the war once and for all. As the North Vietnamese forces began taking over South Vietnam, the Pathet Lao also engaged in a creeping takeover of the Laotian government and began moving toward the capital of Laos. Without major support from the United States, South Vietnam and Laos offered little meaningful resistance, and in 1975, following nearly 20 years of warfare, the Communists emerged victorious. North and South Vietnam were unified under Communist leadership as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and Pathet Lao forces consolidated their power throughout the Kingdom of Laos, forming a new government. In the United States, the effects of the war would linger long after the last troops returned home in 1973. In addition to almost 60,000 fatal casualties, the U.S. spent more than $120 billion on the conflicts in Vietnam and its neighboring nations. This massive spending led to widespread inflation, among other issues. But the U.S. wasn't the only country negatively affected by the conflicts after they had ended. Estimates suggest that by the end of the secret war, 1/10 of the population of Laos, or 200,000 civilians and members of the military, were dead, and twice as many were injured. Additionally, 750,000 Laotians, a full quarter of the population of Laos at the time, had become refugees. An estimated 30% of all the 270 million bombs dropped on Laos during the secret war did not explode. Consequently, more than 80 million undetonated bombs are left scattered and buried across the country to this day. If walked upon, hit, or heated, these devices can explode, severely injuring or killing their victim. Since the end of the secret war, more than 50,000 Laotians have suffered casualties from these remaining bombs. Of these 50,000, about 29,000 people were killed and 21,000 injured. The overwhelming majority are civilians, mainly children who mistake them for toys and farmers who may strike one while plowing their fields. Between 1994 and 2015, the United States contributed an average of $4.9 million per year toward the clearance of bombs in Laos, compared to the $13.3 million they spent per day for 9 years bombing the kingdom. Despite tens of millions of dollars being spent annually on the clearance of bombs, 35% of Laos is still contaminated with unexploded ordnance today. And although the number of deaths has fallen from 200 to 300 annually in the 1990s to around 50 today, thousands of villagers continue to live in fear of the bombs literally buried and hidden under their feet.